I've done talks on this topic twice before at Breaking Convention, so it's never quite the same. So some of you might have heard me talk before, but it all loops in and out of various themes. I'm mainly in Indian studies, that's my main area. But about 15 years ago, I got interested in the topic of Soma and Haoma and what this thing is. And just to summarize, I'm going to talk about first a little bit about the use of this stuff in the traditional way in Iran and in India, and then go on to some of the theories that have been developed. And I'll also talk a little bit about the late Bronze Age and my speculations about the origins of all this. So currently, the brahmans of India, who are the priests, the high caste, they perform rituals in which they drink this, periodically they drink this bitter, sharp, brownish liquid. It's drunk at rituals called Soma Yagya or Soma Yag approximately every 2 hours. It's a very, very ancient tradition, this thing. The brahmins still do this. They know it's a substitute these days and has been a substitute for probably at least about 1,500 years. So when you drink this thing these days, of course, nothing happens. They drink this drink as part of a ritual. And the contents and the structure of this ritual is unchanged almost to the letter for several thousand years, which is quite remarkable. And it involves teams of priests primarily, who are the Brahmins, who assemble, who recite mantras around a fire which is specially constructed. And over a course of the ritual, which might be a 1-day, a 3-day, a 5-day, a 12-day, or even longer rituals, in the Soma rituals, not all Soma rituals, but in the Soma rituals, they drink this thing. Now, also, similarly, in the Zoroastrian tradition, the religion that originated in Persia, it's disputed when it originated, 1500 BC, 700 BC, anyway. But the Zoroastrians, they have the same practice. They think what they call the drink is Haom. It's just the change of the first letter, but it's the same thing. And if you look at the ancient Zoroastrian text, the older part of the Avesta, the language is very, very similar in grammar, in vocabulary, to the most ancient language that is known of India, the language of the Rig Veda, which is the earliest of the Vedas, which are the texts, oral texts, which comprise these mantras, which are recited during rituals. So Soma Haoma has very ancient origins. And the migration of this cult around Asia has been speculated upon, but nobody's really looked at where this thing might have started or how it could have spread. What people have overlooked in the history of the late Bronze Age, the origin, in other words, the origins of this cult, is one particular event which I've been looking at. And it's known that the Bronze Age was a very sophisticated civilization. It's also been demonstrated that there was quite a lot of connection between the ancient Bronze Age city-states of Asia, whether that's stretching all the way from Greece through the Middle East, through Central Asia to India, to the Indus Valley, or what is now in Pakistan. That civilization, as with other civilizations, there's quite a lot of evidence of some sort of cultural contact between these ancient cultures. That's between about 2,500 BC and about 1,600 BC. And then these very sophisticated city-states that had advanced knowledge of agriculture, of metallurgy, of shipbuilding, of astronomy, and so on, suddenly collapsed. And it's interesting because historians have looked at the collapse of these various cultures in different places, all around the same time, but have never questioned why it would have happened simultaneously to all these Bronze Age cultures. Well, in 1615 BC, this date is now pretty precise, plus or minus 15 years, there was the eruption of the volcano of Santorini, which is 120 kilometers north of Crete. And it was the largest volcanic event on Earth, the largest explosion on Earth since the last ice age. And it was so huge, this eruption, that, just to give you a sort of taste of how big this thing was, the Aborigines heard the bang in Alice Springs in Australia. 7 inches of ash fell in South Africa. The skies went black for 5 years in China. There was drought and famine in China under King Che in China, all around 1600 BC. The tsunami went twice the way around the world. The magma was, when it erupted, went 200 miles either side of the epicenter. Now, it's known that this destroyed the Bronze Age culture of Mycenaean culture on Crete, but nobody's considered looking wider at how influential this particular event was globally, if you like. Now, this date is not arbitrary. This has been a process of a long process of investigation by geologists and scientists for centuries, really. And this date, through carbon dating, through looking at ice packs in the Arctic, looking at tree rings in California and other sort of corroborative data, that sort of date has been sort of pretty much nailed down to about 1615 BC. So there's this catastrophic event, 1615 BC, and if these city-states were connected and they were trading and they were dealing with each other, it explains why there was the sudden demise of these city-states in various parts of Asia. Just for one example, the Indus Valley civilization, which is and current Pakistan, which was pretty extensive. It involved about 1 million people, cities of about 40,000 people and so on. One of the world's great experts on that, Asko Parpala, I've talked to him about that. Nobody really knows why the Indus Valley suddenly collapsed, as it were. No evidence of warfare or anything like that. It just sort of collapsed, and there's been speculation about disease, climate change, and so on. But no, I think it was this one single event that triggered the collapse of these civilizations because of the catastrophe that happened on Earth. And of course, the source of lots of legends about Atlantis, the flood, and so on. Now, when this happened, there were large scales large migrations of people all throughout Asia. And similarly, experts on that period of history are puzzled by why there are these large-scale migrations of people, but of course, obviously due to the volcano. So, people from Central Asia, in what is now Turkmenistan, these people started migrating first south into what is now Iran, and then they split into 2 groups, one growing, say not 2 big groups, but waves of migration, going east and going west. And the western lot, they founded what is the next phase of Greek civilization, and the lot going east eventually settled in the Punjab region of northern India, and they brought with them not only features of their religion, but also the drink. The people that migrated to India, they were very successful in battle. They had great chariots, they had horses, and they're very warlike people in general. They weren't civilized in the sense of the previous civilization, as in the Indus Valley, with large buildings and big ships and so on. And then no buildings, but they were very keen on the recitation of the mantras and the performing of these rituals. And as I say, that continues to this day. So what they were drinking is this bitter liquid, and over the last 250 years, there have been numerous attempts to identify what this thing was. And there are essentially 2 schools of scholarship on this. One lot think that in the ancient world, this drink was non-hallucinogenic, if you like. It was a stimulant of some sort. And then there's another lot of scholars who think it was a lot more than just a stimulant. Now, it's very, very difficult to gauge all this stuff just from reading the texts, because the only information we have about their practices in the ancient world are very, very limited to a very comparatively very small number of texts. The consensus these days is that it definitely was some sort of drug they were taking. Now, if it was some sort of drug, that's the debate. What was it? Now, in the hymns, not only of the ancient Zoroastrian religion in the Avesta, but also in the ancient Vedic religion, this thing that they drink is praised in the highest terms as an inspiration, as a healer, as a transmitter of knowledge. as something that confers immortality even on the consumer of this thing. And also something that brings light. And there are very few descriptions of any sort of experience of what you might call Soma intoxication in the Vedas themselves. It's limited to a very few references. There's only really a couple of references where there are passages where where the poets themselves, the composers of these mantras, describe flying through the air or becoming immortal or going into light, and these kinds of descriptions. Whether it's just poetic or not, that's the crucial point. So when it comes to theories about what this thing was, I was surprised how many theories there were when I started looking into this some years ago. I mean, 60 or 70 at least quite well-argued theories about what this plant could be. Well, these days there are only currently 3 theories which are endorsed in any way by people who've looked at this thing in any detail. There are a large number of scholars who believe that the Soma Haoma was the Ephedra plant. And we had some brief discussion about that. So, the Ephedra plant. And the Ephedra is, of course, a stimulant. The issue is whether this thing that they were consuming could have been a plain stimulant, because what happened when you're talking about using a stimulant of any form, whether it's Ephedra or coffee or cocoa or anything, where it's a question of whether you can use this thing in a sustained way over days and days and days of ritual, without what appears to be any hangover side effects or anything like that. The descriptions of the experience, limited as they are, talk about a rebirth of something very profoundly cleansing, if you like, rather than anything that you're recovering from in terms of a drug experience. So up until relatively recently, in the Zoroastrian tradition, they were still using the Ephedra bush. Now, in the Vedas themselves, and to a lesser degree in the Avesta, there are descriptions of what this thing is that they're using. It comes in the form of stalks, which are crushed. And what happens is that the stalks are crushed, or these twigs or whatever they are crushed, and there's a juice extracted. That juice is mixed with water and then with milk, and then it's consumed. Now, the thing that a lot of people have missed when they're looking at the descriptions of the use of this thing is that if you look not only in the Avesta, but also in the Vedas, it talks about many somas or many homas. In fact, Fritz Stahl, who's a great scholar who passed away a few years ago, great scholar of Indian stuff as well as other things, but he was puzzled by the fact that there were many homas in the Avestan tradition. Why many homas? And then also, if you look in the Vedas, I started looking through the Vedas, there are also many descriptions in the Vedas of many somas. The Soma of the mountains, the Soma of the valleys, the Soma of the riverbed, all these different somas. So why is it that there are many somas and many homas? Also, curiously, if you look in the Materia Medica of India, there are approximately 20 plants identified as soma. And for the scholars that are arguing for particular plants, one particular plant, they say, it's got to be that because in this text there, it says this plant is called soma. So that's the plant. And then, of course, other arguments are that then, no, this one's called soma, so that's the plant. But there are many plants called soma. And Zoroastrian specialists have also pointed out that in the preparation of their home, they use the twigs of a plant and another plant, which is also crushed together with the thing in the preparation. Now, Soma or Homa actually doesn't refer to a plant at all. It's from an ancient root, su or hu, which means something pressed in a mortar and pestle, or in the Vedic tradition, they put it on boards, they use stones, and they bang the stones down on these boards to extract the juice from these plants. So, as I say, Ephedra is the plant most supported by Zoroastrian scholars and by quite a few Indologists. Then in 1968, famously, Gordon Wasson, the American banker turned scholar, he published Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, and that caused a huge ripple in the world of Indian studies in particular, because he maintained, or he argued, or he presented a lot of evidence that he thought Soma was the fly-agaric mushroom, as used by shaman in Siberia and for recreational purposes in parts of Russia. So he presented this idea that it was a psychedelic. Now, practically all scholars agree that it was very, very good. He shook the field up and suggested it's a psychedelic. But there are problems, of course, with the mushroom thesis. If you look at the Indian tradition, I suppose the primary objection is that in the Brahmanical tradition, which is very, very conservative, there's an absolute prohibition on eating mushrooms. Also onions and various other things as well, but mushrooms are out. Also, of course, secondly, you don't need to crush mushrooms vigorously with stones or in mortars and pestles. It's the caps primarily that are eaten in the indigenous world. But I think more importantly, fly-agaric is rather unpleasant as an intoxicant. So there are people occasionally who, I've read some reports, people had a great experience with fly-agaric, but normally it's pretty unpleasant. It's a kind of drunkenness, and it's pretty unstable. And of course it contains toxins. You actually need to prepare or dry the caps of the mushrooms, otherwise you do absorb toxins when you consume it. And there's another issue of obtaining enough of these mushrooms at the right time of the year to actually do anything. But I think the most important objections against fly-agaric primarily are the prohibitions in the Brahmanical world, and also the fact that the trip itself is not that. Of course, it's a lot of arguments. You can argue it so many ways, but I don't think it's sustainable over a long period of time that people were doing fly-agaric. The third proposition, the only more recently supported idea about Haoma, is that it was Syrian Root. And there was a very learned book published in '86 by Flattery and Schwartz, two great scholars of Persian and Iranian material. And they argued that it was the Syrian Root plant. And again, because Syrian Root is called hum or home or all these kinds of things. But as some of you will know, Syrian Root on its own if you take enough of it, it's pretty strong. Crucially, it contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine. But it was described that there was a term oneirophrenic, which is used by Claudio Naranjo, who did some pioneering research in the early 1960s on the use of Syrian Root. And it's something that it produces a kind of dreamy kind of state, and not of course all sorts of experiences are possible, but in the Vedas you do get this idea of Soma being something that wakes you up. It's jagravi. It's something that actually wakes you up as a stimulant rather than something that puts you into a dreamy kind of world. None of these arguments are conclusive, by the way, that I'm presenting. It's just it seems to me it's the hypothesis, or the most probable hypothesis about what this thing was. 5 minutes? Okay. So my own speculation is that in the ancient world, they were producing analogues of ayahuasca. They were using different plants. They were using plants that contain monoamine oxidase inhibitors and plants that contain DMT, and, as in the living tradition of South America, additive plants, varying concoctions of these things. This is why you get about 20 plants called Soma in the Materia Medica. And there have been some initial studies on some of the plants that have been mentioned as candidates for Soma in the Materia Medica, but a lot of these plants have never undergone proper tests for psychoactive properties, and I've been having a go at getting some of these plants tested over the last few years with very limited success. But anyway, in conclusion, I think that what was being consumed in the ancient world up till about 1500 years ago was, in fact, not either ephedra, which possibly is an additive. All the things are possible additives to a brew of an ayahuasca kind of brew. It was probably Syrian Root was involved. Very improbable that mushrooms were involved, in my view. In the Brahmanas, which is ancillary text of the Vedas, the Haoma or Soma is a purgative. It causes you to vomit. I mean, it looks so similar to the consumption of ayahuasca. And just finally, I just did a comparison with the Santo Daime ritual, the Santo Daime Church, the ritual of the Santo Daime Church if you look at their rituals, you look at Vedic ritual, it's remarkably similar in terms of structure and lots of other elements. And I think that you can look at the Santorini Church as a church, only relatively new, of course, but they drink ayahuasca at regular intervals, have all these experiences, and it's something that's sustainable without any health damage, whatever, for a considerable period of time. So that's my hypothesis. I wrote a book on this topic. This is this thing here, which has just arrived. I only saw it just this morning, so it's been a long time in the making, but there it is. And on Sunday, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. I think it's 5 o'clock on Sunday. Well, thank you. I'm not sure we've got any time for any questions, but...